with Morningside, uh, I was in Greensboro, North Carolina with my father and my wife, and because my father had a show of his paintings at the International Civil Rights Center and Museum in Greensboro, which is the old Woolworths where the sit-in movement started in 1960. And the woman who organized that said, there are these two people you have to meet. And we went to this little cafe on the edge of downtown Greensboro called Manny's Universal Cafe, and sat there and sat there and sat there and almost left. And all of a sudden, Reverend Nelson Johnson and his wife, Joyce Johnson, walked in. And we sat there for 2 hours and talked to them and heard their story. And the hair stood up on the back of my neck. I was like, who are these people? These people are amazing. And their story, how do I not know about it? And this traumatic story, here are these people sitting in front of me who aren't cynical and are full of love. I need to spend more time around them. So a couple years later, when I had a chance, I was like, I'm going to go back and ask them if I can spend more time with them and learn about more deeply about who they are and what their story is. And to be honest with you, you're right. I felt tapped, and I feel that even more now that the book is out. I feel like this is a responsibility to carry their story. This takes place in the late 70s. So it's 1979. The country is becoming more divided. There's economic uncertainty. Carter's trying to hold on to, his presidency, and Reagan is rising. And there's a lot of tumult in the country. It's this riotous time. The 70s are such a fascinating time. And in Greensboro, you had this group of people, incredibly dedicated activists, who were trying to organize workers in these textile mills in that part of North Carolina that were still some of the largest textile mills in the whole world. They produced Levi's dungaree jean material for 100 years. So anyone wearing Levi's, in the 70s, 80s, 90s came from Greensboro. And so they were working at that and having trouble organizing across the race line, across with getting black and white workers together. And they felt that the Klan was, putting up barriers, like resisting their organizing. And so they decided to have a march to educate workers about why it's important to come together across race so you can make stronger demands to management, for better wages, better health care, et cetera. And they were setting up this march on a Saturday morning on November 3rd, 1979, and all of a sudden a caravan of Klansmen and American Nazis drives up, picks a fight, starts shooting, and 88 seconds later, 5 people are dead and another 10 are injured, some disabled for the rest of their lives. Cars drive off. And what I learned in that moment, when I'm sitting there in 2015, no one was ever held criminally responsible for this. And, you think about that, and there's so many things about it. Like, this is 1979, not 1949. Our justice system can't handle it. What is going on here? And I thought, if I dig deeply in this, it's going to tell me more about America. And boy, I feel like it feels, this took me a long time to write. But boy, it's coming out now, and it feels like it rhymes with so many of the fissures and conflicts that are happening in our country right now. When the justice system couldn't handle this, really, and Greensboro, in a lot of ways, socially, is torn apart over it. There are people who believe that the activists, who were self-proclaimed communists at the time and called themselves the Communist Workers' Party, were to blame for this incident, that they had baited the Klan, that they had, in a sense, wanted martyrs, that they had, caused trouble and kind of deserved it. So there's that narrative. And then there was a narrative that the activists and some others were saying, which was, this was more than just about us and the Klan and the Nazis. This was about the establishment, in a sense, not protecting us. The powers that be, the city government, the state, the police, perhaps the feds, knew more than they said, and didn't protect us. They let this happen. And so this is a story about, in a way, um, how radicals are repressed and suppressed in our culture. And so they would tell that story, and then there was the story at which they were at fault. And over the years, um, they thought, maybe there's another way. And so they were inspired by South Africa and the Truth and Reconciliation process there, and eventually brought over the first place in the United States, in fact, to run a Truth and Reconciliation process to try to understand and create a narrative of what had happened on November 3rd, 1979, that Greensboro could begin to get around and share some of the idea of what the truth about that had been. And so this ran from 2004 to 2006, and it was remarkable. Even though it wasn't supported by the city government, there were Klansmen participated and told their stories, police officers, lawyers, politicians, and of course the activists. So it was a really transformative moment, but not one that created an immediate transformation, but laid the ground for it. Part of the reason this book took me so long was, one, it took me a long time to trust my own version of this. What do I really believe in, and I'm going to put down here? Because some of it's complicated history, right? About, what the FBI knew and didn't know and things like that. So that's part of it. The other was structure, which was what you're talking about. It's how to tell this story. And I knew I wanted to center Nelson and Joyce Johnson. And the question was how to tell their backstory. And that was a very tricky part, and where to end it, to your point. And so one thing that happened while I was working on it, in 2020, after the Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd murders, all of a sudden in October of 2020, the Greensboro City Council calls a special meeting and apologizes for the November 3rd, 1979 massacre. And they say the police could have prevented this. Well, this was a huge moment, and I was in the middle of writing it. So I knew then that in a way, that's where it had to end, but it was going to end there in the epilogue. And that the ending of the book would be at the Truth and Reconciliation process. So it was a tricky book to write because it spans so much time, almost about 50 years of time, in fact. And so that was figuring out how to manage that much time. Whereas my first book really took place in 3 years, much easier to manage 3 years than 50.